Here's the general layout with the pull rod in green and the torsion arm in red. This is where we're heading, folks. The front torsion spring layout is mocked up with these pieces of wood. A pull rod, angled at about 50 degrees, comes down and joins an arm, which then latches onto the torsion spring. The arm would be about 90 to 100 mils long, and the angle here is approaching 90 degrees and could even be 90 degrees, which means that as the suspension rises, it would go over 90 degrees and become a rising rate suspension. Rising rate because the pull rod would get less leverage advantage over the torsion spring as the pull rod moved up and the angle changed. This diagram shows the action of the pull rod and bell crank. It's more or less in proportion to the finished arrangement. You may well ask why I'm going to use such a complicated suspension setup with pull rods and torsion springs and lever arms and bits and pieces cantilevered off in strange directions. Well, there are three reasons. The first reason is I'm using bits that I have lying around from previous builds. I've spoken about that before. So I'm reusing what I've got in the way that it's best suited. The second reason is that because I'm using 10-inch wheels, I'm forced to use mini components, and mini suspend themselves from the top arm, and thus they have a top-loaded ball joint. That means that to get a low profile on the front of the car, I really need a pull rod so that the suspension loads are still taken through the top arm. And the third reason, well, the third reason is because it's fun. And if it wasn't fun, why would you bother building it? I have several sets of VW ball joint torsion bar leaf springs. These are full width, of course, and I'm going to cut them down so that they're much shorter. Now, as they get shorter, their spring rate will increase. I believe overall the spring rate for torsion leaves is linear, but I have to test the torsion leaves in the spring rate so that I have a good idea of how short I need to cut them. I'll check all of this with a torque wrench to see how many degrees of movement I get on the torsion leaves for a certain torque on the torque wrench. $80 Newton meters. $28, $29, $30, $31, $32, $35. I'll now try it with much shorter torsion springs, in this case approximately 25 centimeters. 130 Newton meters at a 25 cm. Pressure's coming on, 32, 34, 35. I stopped at 130 Newton meters. I was pretty sure that I was actually getting twist in the table and the test rig, so the numbers were getting less and less relevant. This chart shows the results of the experimentation. As expected, the spring rate for the torsion springs is linear, and I'm able to project it out in the green, red, and blue lines. The key item is in the top, the actual spring rate based on the linear equation. So for the stock springs, top right in green, it is 2.1529 Newton meters for every degree of twist. it goes up in red to 2.804 for the 350 spring, and for the shortest 250 millimeter spring in testing, it is an increase of 3.68 Newton meters for every degree of twist. I can use this information to equate a torsion spring with a coil spring. I hope I've got these calculations right. If you look at the 250 column, then I can use the 3.6183 Newton meters per degree and then make an assumption about the length of the lever arm and that the force is perpendicular to the lever arm, R. I can use all of this to calculate that a 250 torsion spring is approximately the same as a 6.5 kilograms per millimeter coil spring, and I can make similar calculations for the 350 and 450, which would equate with softer coil springs. This is a Volkswagen beam suspension unit that I have left over from another project. But in reality, all I'm going to use is this quarter here, maybe 300 mils of tube, the needle bearings, and just the start of the arm. This is going to disturb the tranquility of a Sunday morning. Voila! When I get this set up, plus do some suspension geometry modeling, I'll have a much better idea on what I need to do to the torsion bar suspension and pull rod to come up with the final unit. I can't do more at this stage because the upright in this case is from an MGF, and while it's very similar to the upright from a Metro, which is in turn very similar to a Mini, it's in fact not the same, and a 10-inch wheel will not fit over an MGF hub, in particular because the discs go over the drive flange on the MGF and behind the drive flange on the Mini and Metro. The torsion beam itself would be part of the chassis, and you can see here that this is the item that I removed from the Volkswagen beam axle, and I'm going to cut it even shorter where the blue tape is. I'll wrap it at this point. The next video will cover fabrication of the torsion springs, the arms, the pull rod, such like.